Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video we're going to talk about let and const, which are the two new keywords that's been introduced in ES6. And the very first thing we're going to do is, I have Codepen I open in Google Chrome. I'm going to go ahead and create a new pen. So we're not going to need any HTML or CSS for this tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and modify the CSS and HTML tabs. And we're just going to need the console output right there. So I'm going to go to change view. And I'm going to set this layout so that we have JavaScript on the left and we have the console output on the right. And the very first thing you need to do is you need to go to settings and you want to click on the JavaScript tab. And the thing you want to do is you want to select Babel from the list of JavaScript preprocessors. So if you watched the very first video, we kind of touched upon Babel a little bit. And Babel, in short, is basically a preprocessor, JavaScript preprocessor, that allows you to transform ES6 code to ES5 code. Now, in this case, like I said, most of the features in ES6 are already supported by browsers like Chrome, Edge, Firefox, and Safari, but some of the features are not. And just so that we have full access to those features, just so that we have all the greatest and latest editions of ES6, we want to make sure we select Babel. That's basically going to give us access to all of those perks. So with that in place, let us close that. And let's go back to let and const. Well, if you've been using JavaScript, you've probably seen the var keyword. And the var keyword basically allows you to declare variables as well as assign values to them. So what is the problem with using the var keyword? You might ask yourself. Why not just stick to that? Why do we need to care about let and const? What's the problem with var? Well, var is basically a keyword that allows you to declare or initialize traditional variables or variables that are scoped to a function. Now, you just heard me use the term scoped. We talk about scope. Scope is actually not limited to JavaScript. Scope is a notion that's also common in other languages as well. So scope is basically nothing more than just an area of your code where the variables or the functions that you define as a programmer are accessible. So let's say we have a function. We want to do some kind of a processing in there, so we're going to call it process. And inside that process function, we're going to have a variable, maybe age, set it to 21, and we're going to go ahead and call that function. So in this case, the function doesn't do anything at all, just creates a variable. But the thing to understand is that the variable that we create inside the function, inside the process function, well, it only exists within the curly braces. So it only exists within the block of that function. So you can access the var, the age variable outside the process function. So if I try to do console log age, well, that's not going to do anything. And if you open the console log in Chrome, you're actually going to see a reference error that says age is not defined. Now that's something that you would expect, right? Because age is not actually being defined anywhere within this area. So it's being defined within the function, but it's not actually accessible from outside. So when we talk about the function scope, we actually mean that everything that's defined within a function, so in this case we have a process function, everything that's defined inside, meaning within the curly braces, is only accessible from within that function. So you can't access, let's say, a variable age from outside the process function. So this is as far as scope goes. So let's go back to this function and let's complicate it a little bit. So let's go ahead and create an if condition. So let's say if age is less than 21, we want to create a new variable. Maybe we'll say is liable. We're going to set it to false. Now, so far so good. We have an if block with a variable. Now, what if you go ahead and try to console log is liable? What do you think is going to happen? But in this case, we get undefined. So this may not be obvious to you. This might not make sense to you because the if condition is actually false because age is 21. 21 is not less than 21, so we don't actually get inside this block. So seemingly, if I comment out this line, what do you expect the output of is liable to be? So what I mean is, if I comment this out, do you think we're still going to get undefined? Well, actually, no. We get a reference error that says is liable is not defined. So we don't get undefined. So before, let me Just to make this clear, I'm going to clear the the log. I'm going to remove the comments. We get undefined. But if you comment out the variable initialization, we get a reference error. So what the hell is going on? Well, in order to be able to understand what's going on behind the scenes, actually this has to do with a JavaScript behavior that's known as hoisting. So hoisting is basically an interesting behavior or quirk in JavaScript in which the variables and functions that you declare or define are actually put into memory before any of your code executes. The code that we had before, right, there was a variable is liable. So actually what happens behind the scenes is that the is liable variable is sort of like moved to the top of the scope. So it actually is being accessed from outside the if block. So the variable is declared outside, and then it's being assigned the value of false inside the block. So even though you never actually get to the block, so if I kill it completely, we still have the is liable declaration, and that's why we get undefined. Don't let undefined confuse you, because undefined is simply a special value in JavaScript that means that a variable doesn't have any value. So in this case, we have sort of like an empty variable that doesn't hold anything. It's just a declaration, it's just a label that doesn't hold any value. So in this case, JavaScript basically assigns the special keyword known as undefined to it. So it's sort of like the same as saying is undefined is equal to undefined. And that's pretty much the same thing. So, but going back to the example with the if block, it kind of doesn't make sense that JavaScript would actually move the variable declaration outside the if block, and then you write your code and all of a sudden is liable is still being accessed from outside the if block, even though the if condition is always false. So that doesn't really make any sense. And in order to be able to avoid that, well, we can actually do that in ES6. So ES6 brings up the let and const keywords. So in this case, if you have the let keyword, right? So let me just clear out the logs again. If we had var, again, this is going to give us undefined. If you change this to let, this is going to give us a reference error. So you don't see anything in the console output. This is the old one from the time when we had the var keyword. But if you have the let keyword, you're going to get a reference error. Now this makes sense because let is a keyword that basically allows you to define a variable that's scoped to a block. So a block is basically any code, any JavaScript code that's being limited by the curly braces. So everything inside the curly braces of an if statement is basically a block. So the let keyword allows us to create a variable that's scoped to that block. So that means you can't access this variable from outside the if block. Pretty much the same way as we try to access age from outside the function. It's sort of the same, except with a function we get a function scope, and with a block we get a block scope. So let is sort of like a magical keyword, pretty much the same as const, because if you put const, it's going to behave in the same way, which we're still going to get a reference error because the variable that's defined inside the block is only scoped to that block. So if it's still kind of confusing, a good example to look at would be a for loop. So let's say you want to loop 10 times. So you might have a variable I set to 0, and then you have a condition. If I is less than 0, then you want to quit the loop and you want to increment the counter variable by 1. And so you just want to go ahead and maybe console log. Well, before that, let me just clear out the logs. And you want to go ahead and console log I. So again, pretty simple. It's just going to output 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And in this case, what if you tried to console log I, but outside the for loop? So with for loop, again, it's a block, right? So it's pretty much the same as an if statement. It's still a block, right? So even though you have a variable defined within the block, well, it's actually being initialized within the block, but it's being declared outside the block. So actually what it ends up looking in the end is more like this, right? So you have your variable that's sort of like being assigned undefined in the beginning, and then it's being assigned 0 on the first iteration, and then on every single iteration it's being incremented until it gets to the value of 10, in which case this condition will be false. right? 10 is equal to 10, and then you would quit the loop, and outside the loop you would get a 10, and this is why you get a 10 at the end. So again, this is a little bit confusing. Usually you don't assign undefined to variables. You might simply just omit it, or you might just have a declaration. But even then, you don't actually declare variables outside the loops. Usually if it's something like a for loop, you would just have a variable initialization inside. But because we talked about the function scope, the for block itself, it still follows the rules of a function scope. So everything that's defined right there, so all the code that we've written, it exists in the same scope. It exists within the same global scope in this case, because we don't actually have any function. If we have everything wrapped inside the function, right, we could still have our good old process function, right, and we could take all of it and put it back inside the function. Well, in this case, we have a function scope because everything is defined inside the function, and we call process. We're going to get the same output. But as we did before, we didn't have any function, so we just had the loop, and we had a few console logs. So in this case, this is what's called a global scope because it's being defined at the top scope of JavaScript. We don't have any functions here. So again, this is a little bit confusing, and in order to alleviate that problem, instead of using var, you might just use let. So let me clear the logs right here. Let me go ahead and define a let I equals 0, and everything else remains the same. And once that executes, we get the same output. We get everything from 0 to 9, and then at the very end, we don't actually get a 10, because remember when we had a var, we would get a 10 because the variable would still be hoisted to the top of the scope, of this global scope, would still get a 10 that's been incremented at the very end of this for loop. Well, in this case, we don't get a 10 because the I variable is being defined from within the loop, so naturally it's only accessible within that loop, within the block of that loop, so it's not possible to access it outside the loop. So this is as far as let goes. Now, what's the difference between let and const? Const behaves pretty much the same way as let, except it allows you to define variables that are essentially immutable. So let's say you have a person object and you have a property called name. So if you tried to assign person to something else and you did a console log of person, and let's clear out the logs. So in this case, you see an exclamation point right there. Well, it says unknown person is read only. So basically what this error says is that person is a read only variable, which means that you can't actually reassign it to anything else. And just to prove the point, if you console log out person before the reassignment, well, you might expect that it's going to work just fine. In this case, it doesn't even compile actually because you're trying to reassign the value. This is not even valid, so it doesn't print out anything. So let's remove the reassignment. In this case, we still have the person object prints out well. Now, don't be confused with the const keyword because unlike other languages like Java or C#, if you have a constant in JavaScript, you're still allowed to modify the object properties, even though it's a constant variable. So if you try to, let's say, assign a new value to the name property, let's say Jack instead of Alex, and then you did a console log name, again, just to prove the point, let's console log person before and after, so it's not name, it's person, after we modify it, right? So we get object Alex right there, object with the name of Alex, and then object with the name of Jack. So as I said, you can pretty much modify properties of objects, or you can assign new elements to arrays, or you can remove elements from arrays, and this is still normal. This is still allowed within the context of using a const. So just to be clear, const doesn't actually create any immutable variables. It simply allows you to create variables that cannot be reassigned. So like I showed you, if you try to assign something else to person, that's not even going to execute. That's going to break immediately because when you use a constant, that means that you're creating a variable that cannot be reassigned. So you're still allowed to alter the value of an object, but the binding between the variable and the object in the memory remains the same. So if you actually wanted to be able to have objects that are completely mutable, like you can't modify any properties, or if it's an array you can, add new values or remove values, there's a handy method on the object class or the object prototype that basically allows you to freeze any type of object. So in this case, let's say person, and if I try to do like person name equals Jack, right? So in this case, we're gonna get a type error that basically says you cannot assign a new property if you can't modify the property on an object that's read only. So this is basically as far as const goes. And again, just as a quick recap, let and const pretty much work in the same way. They essentially replace the var keyword. Like I said, we talked about scope, we talked about hoisting. In this case, even if you want to declare a global variable, you have no reason to use var anymore. You could still use let or const at the top of your scope. That's still going to create variables that are accessible to any functions or any variables that you have after that definition. So as long as you define them at the very top of your scope, you're going to be good. So at this point, you could pretty much forget about var, use let or use const if you have values that you know shouldn't change. So what are some of the use cases? Well, a good use case for a value or variable that you don't want to be able to reassign would be modules. So let's say you're building an application in Node.js, and let's say you want to import an HTTP module, right, which is a built-in module. So you do something like const HTTP require HTTP at the top of your project, top of your file, right? It could be something like index.js or server.js, and at the command line you might call that file in order to create the server. Well, in this case, you're just gonna import the library and assign it to the const variable. In this case, you know that the library is not going to change, so you could still use let. I mean, there's no problem with that, but it still makes sense to use const because you know that the module or the library is not going to change. It's pretty much immutable, so you can assign it to const and be sure that if you accidentally try to assign HTTP to something else down the line, that it's not going to work. It's just going to give you a reference error because you can't assign a different value to that type of variable. But in this case, it still breaks because we're actually in the context of browsers, so you can't actually require any module. This module, HTTP, doesn't even exist within this context, so you can't actually require it. But if you had something like Node.js, it would make more sense. Or let's say if you're familiar with Firebase, basically Firebase, it's a web-based database and storage service provider. So in Firebase, you might do something like constant DB, or short for database. Given that you have a Firebase reference imported, you might do firebase.database, and that basically makes call to Firebase. It sort of fetches, and then usually you just pass some kind of an object, configuration object, or this might be stored in a variable even. So when you make that call, given that you have a Firebase library, that basically gives you a reference to the Firebase database. Now, the reference to the Firebase database would be permanent. It would be consistent. It would not be mutable, right? So it does make sense to assign it to a constant variable. So even though it's still possible to, go ahead and try to modify some properties on the database object and assign it to, some gibberish, it still makes sense. It would still work. But if you try to reassign database to something else, well, that's going to break, obviously. Well, in this case, we can't even execute it, obviously, because we don't have any Firebase reference defined. Firebase is not even a valid object here, so this is why it's breaking. But if you had Firebase, it would make sense. Or like I said, modules in Node.js also makes a lot of sense. So lastly, a very quick recap. Let and const are basically the two new keywords in ES6. They allow you to declare and initialize variables inside the context of a block. And a block could be an if statement, could be a for loop, a while loop, It could even be just two curly braces. That's valid JavaScript. So you could have some kind of a variable foo equals bar, whatever. That's a block. So foo would not be accessible outside that block. This is the whole idea of let and const. And the very last thing is, like I said, const basically allows you to define special type of variables which are still mutable. So if it's an object, you can still modify the properties, or if it's an array, you can add more values to that array, or you can remove values from the array. Those objects are still mutable, but if you use const, that basically guarantees that you can't reassign new values to those variables. So it kind of protects you from accidentally changing the values that are being assigned to those values. And the very last thing is, an interesting behavior with let and const. Let's say you had some kind of a variable, let's say age equals 21, and you had a block. Let's say if it's going to be a true condition, so meaning that it's always going to be executed. And inside that if block, let's say you try to create another age variable and assign 50 to it. So we're going to go ahead and try to console log 50. I'm going to clear out the logs so they don't distract us. And let's console log age outside the if block. So what do you think is going to happen? In this case, we get 50. So this is the first output. That's the second. We get 50 from the first console log because it's being outputted from within this if block. So this age variable, even though it has the same name as the variable outside of the block, it's still sort of like being masked, or it's being scoped to this block. So this variable only makes sense within that block, and it's not conflicting with the age variable from outside. It's still within the block. It's still perfectly permissible. It's perfectly okay. You can declare variables like that, and they're not in conflict with the variables from outside. So in this case, it works because the variable is being scoped to the if block, so it's perfectly fine. So this is pretty much it for the lesson. Thanks a lot for checking it out, and I hope to see you in the next episode.